Welcome to Dig, a history podcast.
When I was a kid, I was really into music, especially music from earlier generations. The radio in my room was a huge part of my life. Not only would I sit and listen to the oldies station for hours while I read or played, my radio had that amazing piece of technology from the 90s, a tape deck. Music became something that I bonded with my grandpa, Mike Foose, over. When he was younger, before arthritis made it impossible for him to play, my grandpa Foose played the guitar and the harmonica and often entertained his friends and family with his renditions of country and western songs. So when I got interested in older music, Grandpa saw this as an opportunity to give me something of an education by providing me with a steady stream of mixtapes featuring a mix of country and western and folk music by artists like Johnny Cash and the comic singer-songwriter Ray Stevens. But one song always stuck out to me, the Kingston Trio's haunting folk song, Tom Dooley.
The lyrics of Tom Dooley go like this. I met her on the mountain, there I took her life. Met her on the mountain, stabbed her with my knife. Hang down your head, Tom Dooley. Hang down your head and cry. Hang down your head, Tom Dooley. Poor boy, you're bound to die. The song tells the story of a man named Tom Dooley who murdered a woman and who, as a consequence, must now hang from a white oak tree. These dark lyrics, combined with the mournful harmonies, result in a song that's at once lively and fun to sing along with, but also strangely unsettling.
And if you look through recordings of country, western, and folk music ranging from the 1920s and 30s through to the present, you'll notice a theme. Songs about crime, murder, and executions are ever present. From Grayson and Whittier's recording of the centuries-old ballad Rose Connolly in 1927, to Lloyd Wilson's Stagger Lee, recorded in the 1950s, Bob Dylan's The Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll in the 1960s, to Johnny Cash's Delia's Gone in the 1990s, to Jason Isbell's Live Oak or Yvette, or Zach Bryan's Birmingham in more recent years, songs about murder are a staple of American musical traditions. How did songs about violence and crime become quite so central? Today, for our spooky in our spooky series, we'll take a closer look at the American murder ballad tradition, tracing them back to the real crimes that inspired them, yes, but also considering what they might teach us about race, gender, and American culture. I'm Sarah.
And I'm Marissa.
And we are your historians for this episode of Dig.
We are so thankful for all of our Patreon supporters, especially our auger and excavator level patrons. Carl, Alyssa, Maria, Colin, Denise, Edward, Jesse, Judy, Karen, Lauren, Lisa, Megan, and Susan. We can't thank you enough. Listener, if you enjoy what we do here, but you aren't yet a patron of the show, it's easy. Just go to patreon.com/digpodcast to learn more.
As always, we like to start by acknowledging the scholars who helped shape our work here on this podcast. This episode was a real doozy to read and write because there is a huge and vibrant field of historians, musicologists, folklorists, musicians, and fans who have written about murder ballads for a very long time, like hundreds of years. But I especially want to mention the British music journalist Paul Slade, who has done an enormous amount of work writing not only about the history of murder ballads, but the more recent history of who has performed and recorded them as well. His book on murder ballads is a must read. I also used Cecil Brown's amazing book, Stagger Lee Shot Billy, John Foster West's Lift Up Your Head, Tom Dula, Sean Willenson Greel Marcus's anthology, The Rose and Briar, plus many, many more, the work of many, many more folklorists and Appalachian scholars whose work that I also relied on. I also tried to link really liberally throughout the copy so that you can read the lyrics of many of these songs and listen to recording where they exist for yourself. I also am thinking maybe I should make a Spotify playlist. Ballads have existed for centuries, emerging in Europe sometime in the Middle Ages. Today, we often use the word ballad as a shorthand for a love song, but musically speaking, the term ballad, at least initially, referred to a song with a very specific rhyme scheme and rhythm. Ballads typically use quatrains, or 4-line stanzas, with ABCB or ABAB rhyme schemes. Medieval ballads also typically used an alternating structure of iambic tetrameter and iambic trimeter lines. Iambic refers to the stress placed on the syllables, so dun 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 dun, like having the different stresses, right? And tetrameter means having 8 syllables, while trimeter means 6 syllables. So, to give you a sense of what this actually means, take, for instance, this quatrain from a version of the 16th century English ballad, Lord Thomas and Fair Annette. The horse Fair Anne at rode upon, he ambled like the wind. With silver he was shod before, with burning gold behind. That rhythm, that dun 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 dun, right? The horse Fair Anne at rode upon. That rhythm has persisted in ballads for centuries. In fact, you can still hear that same pattern in the Kingston Trio's recording of Tom Dooley hundreds of years after Lord Thomas and Fair Anne. Hang down your head, Tom Dooley. Hang down your head and cry. Hang down your head, Tom Dooley. Poor boy, you're bound to die. You can hear it also in the Louvin brothers' famous recording of the Knoxville Girl, which we'll talk about later on. She fell down on her bended knee, for mercy she did cry. Oh, Willie, dear, don't kill me here. I'm unprepared to die.
Musically, ballads evolved out of the tradition of dance songs and narrative poems. The rhythm and format was influenced by traditional French and Danish carols and dancing songs. In fact, the word ballad likely comes from the Latin word ballare, or to dance. In the Danish tradition, a singer would recite a narrative poem while accompanied by a fiddle in the middle of a ring of singers. As time went on, these dance poems became less common, instead evolving into 2 distinct things: dance songs and poetry. But simplified ballads, which were shorter and had standard formats and told compelling stories that appealed to mass audiences, had staying power. In terms of the actual narratives or subject matter in ballads that likely was influenced by Germanic epics, the French chanson de geste and the medieval chivalric romances. German epics are spoken poems that relay tales of heroes seeking honor and glory through some kind of adventure. The most famous Germanic epic is Beowulf, which tells the tale of the heroic Beowulf who defeats the monster Grendel and also his monster mom. The French chanson de geste is another medieval epic poem, typically sung or recited by entertainers and minstrels, that included some heroic elements, but also aspects of realism about life at court or in the city. The most famous chanson de geste is the Song of Roland, not the Dark Tower novel by Stephen King, but the poem about the war hero Roland during the reign of Charlemagne. Chivalric romances, sometimes written in poetic form, are tales that told the story of heroic knights who wander about on quests, often in the service of a lovely and somewhat inaccessible woman, encountering fantastical things like dragons. Ballads took the storytelling tradition from those formats, but simplified them and set them to music.
Ballads were entertainment for the masses. According to scholar John Houseman, quote, "The ballad public was not found in the great courts, but in smaller feudal castles and manor houses, and in the village communities dependent on them. Entertainment was supplied by the traveling minstrel, who molded the long narratives of epic and romance, suitable only for leisurely circles, into the crisper and more economic form of the ballad narrative," end quote. Ballads were fairly simple, easy to listen to and remember, and passed from performer to performer in an informal communal system. Thus, says Houseman, quote, ballads survived on the lips of the people, and though based on written sources, in course of time they became the property of the people who sang them, moving further and further away from their literary origins, end quote. Ballads, then, are an oral tradition, one that can really only be understood and appreciated when heard or sung rather than read.
Because they were meant to be heard by a diverse population of listeners in the community, ballads came to deal with extreme emotions and events, which evoked a sense of empathy or understanding even across time or community. In other words, when a balladeer sang about the tragic and untimely death of a beautiful young woman at the hands of a dangerous and mean man, people could understand that scenario even if the actual inspiring event had been long since forgotten. Ballads typically were not religious, but especially in English and Scottish ballads could have supernatural elements. Take, for instance, the traditional ballad Tam Lin, which dates back to at least the mid-16th century and was recorded by the famous Scottish poet Robert Burns in 1769. The ballad tells the story of the elf man Tam Lin, who is saved from the clutches of the fairy queen by a human lover named Janet. Another, The Unquiet Grave, features the dead beginning to rise from their graves. Here's one version of the lyrics. How cold the wind do blow, dear love, and see the drops of rain. I never had but one true love, in the greenwood he was slain. I would do as much for my own true love as in my power doth lay. I would sit and mourn all on his grave for 12 months and a day. A 12 month and a day being past, his ghost did rise and speak. What makes you mourn all on my grave? For you will not let me sleep. It is not your gold I want, dear love, nor yet your wealth I crave, but one kiss from your lily-white lips is all I wish to have. Your lips are as cold as clay, dear love, your breath doth smell so strong. I am afraid, my pretty, pretty maid, your time will not be long.
One of the reasons I wanted to include that is, of course, because it sort of sets this example of like morbid and, you know, dark themes in ballads, but also like every version of this includes some line in which she talks about how disgusting her dead lover's breath smells. It's just like
wanting to kiss his dead mouth or whatever. I don't know.
Exactly. But then she's like, oh, your breath is so gross. Like, what did you expect?
It reminds me of that one scene from Hocus Pocus when they wake up Billy and his mouth is, you know, sewn shut, and then he opens it up and goes and like it reminds me of that because I always, when I was little, I was like, oh, that probably stinks so bad.
Yep, that's actually probably exactly what this looked like. As both of those traditional Scottish and English ballads suggest, ballads also usually had a strong theme of love and romance, sometimes happy and sometimes tragic. Take The Gay Goshawk, which tells the story of a young English woman who is in love with a Scottish man who sends her letters using a goshawk to carry them. Her father refuses to let her go to him, so instead she makes her father promise that if she dies, he will bury her in Scotland. So she takes a sleeping potion to look as though she's dead. Her brothers then dutifully take her to Scotland for her burial, and when her Scottish lover arrives to mourn her, she conveniently wakes up, asks for bread and wine because she's really hungry, and sends her brothers away. So I really like that one. Ballads also told the story of remarkable historical events that would have excited public audiences, especially with scandalous stories about criminals, murderers, and public executions. The Scottish ballad Mary Hamilton tells the story of the execution of Mary Hamilton, a maid-in-waiting to Mary Queen of Scots, who was swindled by a lover and killed the resulting baby. Quote, she tied it in her apron, and she'd thrown it in the sea. Says, sink ye, swim ye, bonny wee bab, you'll never get mair o' me. It's unclear what the historical inspiration for this particular ballad was. There have been people who have tried to research it. And Mary Queen of Scots did have ladies in waiting named Mary, but there's no evidence for this particularly shocking event. Another, called Johnny Armstrong, is about a reiver, kind of like a bandit, who rambled about committing crimes on the Scottish-English border in the 16th century. Johnny was finally caught in 1530 by the English and executed. The ballad goes like this. John murdered was at Carlingrig, and all his gallant company, but Scotland's heart was ne'er sae way to see sae mony brave men die, because they saved their country dear from Englishmen, nane were saw so bold, while Johnny lived on the border side, none of them durst come near his hold. That was my really American pathetic attempt at how it is written in the Gaelic.
Yeah, and that's modern English, by the way, just so you know. It's modern English, like that's Shakespeare's English, but it's like during the vowel shift. So that's why there's like weird stuff happening. And also they just like spelled however they wanted to. They were like, F it.
Right. And it's Scottish. So it's like, it's got that sort of like Gaelic influence in the spelling of the pronunciation, I should say, too.
Murder and mayhem have always been key features of ballads. Take the Twa Sisters, which dates back at least to the mid-17th century and was printed on a broadside in 1656. The song tells the story of two sisters who go down to the seaside to watch their father's ship come in. While standing there, the older sister throws the younger into the water and lets her drown, despite her piteous cries. The body of the younger sister then floats away, ending up in a mill dam. There, the miller finds her lifeless body and takes her body apart and turns her body into an instrument. In one version, he turns her bones into a violin. In others, her beautiful yellow hair becomes the strings of a harp. Yikes. That is dark. Edward is a ballad that likely emerged in the mid-17th century, and in this one, a mother asks her son Davy why there's blood on his sword or hunting knife. He claims it's the blood of a hawk, and then a dog or horse, and then finally admits he's killed someone. In some versions, his brother, in others, his father. Babylon, or the Bonnie Banks 040, is about an outlaw who meets three young women in the woods. He asks each one to either agree to marry him or die by his knife. The first two sisters refuse to marry him and thus are killed. The third one also refuses to marry him, but also refuses to be killed. Apparently the first two didn't see this as an option. Okay, so here's what happens next. Quote, I'll not be a rank robber's wife. For I hae a brother in this wood. Again ye kill me, and he'll kill thee. End quote. The robber asks what her brother's name is and suddenly realizes that the girls were his own sisters.
Dun, dun, dun.
Dun. Ah! Then, of course, the outlaw takes his own life with his knife, sparing the final sister. Interestingly enough, both Edward and Babylon were also commonly sung around Scandinavia.
One of the things I also think is interesting is that the ballad Edward is about a young man named Davy, and there's no one in it named Edward. So I don't know why it's called Edward.
Is that his brother or his father that he killed?
I don't think so. Like, the word Edward didn't appear in any of the versions that I read. So, with the invention of printing in the 16th and 17th centuries, ballads became not just an oral or sung-performed tradition, but a written one as well. Scholars Patricia Fumerton and Anita Guarini suggest that printed ballads were, quote, by far the most printed medium in the literary marketplace of London. There is something of a split in the study of ballads today over printed versus sung / performed / oral tradition ballads. While musicologists and folklorists concentrate on the sung ballads, literary scholars, art historians, and historians have concentrated mostly on print ballads. Some scholars of the sung ballads see them as wholly distinct from print ballads, while others see them as interconnected traditions. But still, the popularity of ballads that told chilling stories of murder, especially those that dealt with the violent death of a beautiful young woman at the hands of a lover, remained hugely popular. I found one digitized by the University of Manchester called The Gosport Tragedy, which turns out to be really, really important. It is just one version of a song that has probably dozens of iterations. The printed lyrics are quite long, 16 stanzas, instead of most earlier ballads, which tend to be only 8 or 10 or 12 stanzas or thereabouts. The Gosport Tragedy is about a young couple named William and Molly. William is trying to convince Molly to marry him. Mostly, it seems, so that she will consent to sleep with him. Molly then replies that she doesn't trust men who have a tendency to just betray their promises to young women after they get the sex that they want. So finally, William wears Molly down and she does sleep with him. And then, of course, she immediately gets pregnant. William, a ship's carpenter, is about to go off to sea, but he promises that they will wed before he leaves. But when William meets her early in the morning before their wedding, he tells her he must take her through the woods to meet a friend first. Molly sees right through this facade. Quote, "At length this maiden began for to weep, saying, 'William, I fancy thou leadst me astray, on purpose my innocent life to betray.' William's reply is chilling. Quote, he said, 'That is true, and none can you save, for I all this night have been digging your grave.' She begs for her and her unborn child's life, but he refuses. Quote, he said, 'There's no time disputing to stand,' so instantly taking the knife in his hand, he pierced her body till blood it did flow, then into the grave her body did throw." Happily, later in this ballad, the ghost of the murdered girl then haunts her killer until he is driven mad, confesses his crime, and then dies. So she gets some revenge. The Gosport tragedy has numerous later versions, and its central theme, this theme of a man killing a beautiful young woman with whom he has either already had sex and impregnated or who he wants to have sex with and who has rejected him, comes up over and over and over and over again.
I just Googled why the ballad Edward is called Edward. And it turns out that in the English version, the boy's name is Edward. But in the Scottish version, his name is Davy.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't see any of the Edward ones.
Yeah, they didn't change. I think that the Edward ones are not common, and they're very early. But somehow the boy's name got changed, but the name of the ballad didn't get changed, which is weird and dumb. But that's how history is. Sometimes things are just weird and incomplete and don't make sense. So, despite their romantic or murderous content and general popularity, which might associate them with low culture, English and Scottish ballads have long been understood as a unique and important artifact of those cultures. While folks had worked on collecting and documenting ballads and their many variations since probably the mid-18th century, the most significant collection was undertaken by Francis James Child, who was the Boylston Professor of Rhetoric and Oratory, then later the first ever professor of English at Harvard University in the last half of the 19th century. In the 1850s, Child began work on what would later be understood as his masterwork, English and Scottish Ballads, in 8 volumes. What drew Child to the ballads was precisely the difference between oral or sung ballads and written ones. The switch from oral to printed English led Child to become, in the words of folklorist David Bynum, quote, "inevitably drawn to pondering the essential differences between speech and writing, and to searching for the origins of thoughtful expression in English," end quote. The result was a collection of 350 ballads that quickly became something of a canon of English and Scottish ballads. To this day, when you look up information about a particular ballad, it comes with a series of identification numbers. For instance, Tam Lin is Child 39, and the 39th ballad in Child's collection, while Mary Hamilton is Child 173. As an aside, many traditional ballads also have another number. For instance, Tam Lin is Child 39, but also Roud 35, which refers to the much larger and more modern folk song index developed by folklorist Steve Roud.
With the careful documentation of the 350 canonical Child ballads, Child set something of a trend in ballad hunting in the United States, as folklorists and ethnographers went out to search for evidence of Child's canonical songs in the American popular musical tradition. Focus quickly centered on the Appalachian region, which quickly became the center of folk life and folk music research during the 19 teens, 20s, and 30s. For instance, when University of Missouri professor Harry Belden was overseeing an English club event in which students read aloud their own stories, a student included a song in a story that she claimed was something that she had heard at her home in the rural Ozarks, but which Belden recognized immediately as a child ballad. The student didn't know what a child ballad was, but she knew the song from growing up singing it and others with her community. Inspired by Child's work documenting English and Scottish ballads and cementing their place in defining British and Scottish culture, ballad hunters and song catchers like Belden then went out to find how those ballads had then made a home in America.
At the same time, geologists and geographers were developing theories about region, which scholars like John Wesley Powell used to refer to as, quote, a territory whose human institutions and outlooks were derived from the environmental features that set the territory apart from other regions, end quote. In other words, there was a growing belief that environment and humans interacted to develop unique cultures. The result was the development of a kind of mashup of geography and anthropology, which looked at the interactions between geography and human cultures. Again, Appalachia stood out as one such unique region that drew academic interest. For instance, the geographer Ellen Churchill Semple wrote in an essay in 1901 that first suggested it was the topography of Appalachia that created a unique experience of isolation and poverty, which held cultural development back from progress. This is a very 1901 essay indeed, a little bit semi-eugenical, I guess. But Appalachian ballad hunters meant something specific when they said that the landscape, quote, held the culture back. In this case, the existence of child ballads in the culture of Appalachia and its rural surroundings, like the further west Ozarks, was evidence of an ethnically pure Anglo-Saxon Protestant race. For some folklorists and ballad hunters, ballads were proof of a kind of Ur-American of English origins, untouched by the pernicious effects of cultural diffusion or religious diversity. One of the most famous ballad hunters, the Englishman Cecil Sharp, saw ballads as proof that Appalachians were inherently English. Quote, although the people are so English they have their American quality and that they are freer than the English peasant, they have their own land and have done so for 3 or 4 generations, so that there is none of that servility which unhappily is one of the characterizations of the English peasant, end quote. Unlike Semple, Sharp saw Appalachian culture as not being slow to develop, but rather immune to negative change. Quote, a case of arrested development? I should prefer to call it a case of arrested degeneration, end quote. In other words, from an Englishman's perspective, the ballads were evidence of an old-time English culture untouched by time.
Ballad hunters were especially tied to the belief that Appalachia had been settled almost entirely by Protestant English and Scots-Irish immigrants. There is some truth to that, of course. In the mid-18th century, there was a significant influx of Protestant, English, and Scottish immigration to places like North Carolina, and it is likely how the child ballads arrived in Appalachia in the first place. But in focusing on these canonical ballads, ballad catchers were reinforcing a version of Appalachian culture that wasn't entirely accurate, and which reflected their own beliefs about ethnic purity and quote-unquote true Americanness. Robert Winslow Gordon, a Harvard-trained ballad hunter that worked in Appalachia, saw ballads as evidence of the true American past. Quote, personally, I frankly believe that the whole project of reviving and making known our true American stuff is one of the most worthwhile things to be done today. From the point of view of true Americanism, that stuff is the very soul of our past, of pioneers, of the men who made America. It's not modern Hebrew Broadway jazz. Yikes.
What the
This, of course, was also a white, as you can tell from this quote, right? This is a white and Protestant Christian culture as far as scholars were concerned. John C. Campbell, who deeply researched life in Appalachia, downplayed the African-American presence in the region and suggested that it was, if not culturally irrelevant, a negative influence limited only to the cities. In their search for authentic and quote-unquote pure ballads, songcatchers outright ignored songs that weren't British or Scottish in origin, even if they were musically or thematically similar. For instance, Cecil Sharp encountered but did not document American ballads, ones that had originated in America, like Tom Dooley, even though they were extremely similar to child ballads because they were American in origin and thus inferior. Songs that suggested Black, German, or Irish musical influence were especially bad. Cecil Sharp was seeking ethnically pure English ballads only. As John Williams writes, quote, Sharp traveled the railroads of the Upper South oblivious to the African-American blues and banjo and gospel music that must have been all around him, suffering no epiphanies such as the one that had started his collecting career many years before when he chanced to hear a gardener singing while at work on the greenery of an English country parsonage. So when Cecil Sharp encountered non-white Appalachians and songs that didn't fit his preconceived notions of child ballads, he treated them all like anomalies rather than like true Appalachians. Another really interesting example of this, I think, is the case of the ballad Rose Connolly. Ballad hunters like Cecil Sharp were seeking specifically English and Scottish songs and rejected all others. One such song was Rose Connolly, also called Down in the Willow Garden. This bloody little song tells the story of a man so desperate to kill his lover that he poisons, stabs, and finally drowns her. Quote, I drew a saber through her, which were a bloody knife. I threw her into the river, which were a dreadful sight. My father always had told me that money would set me free if I would murder that pretty little lass whose name was Rose Connolly. The song is Irish, not British or Scottish, and likely emerged around 1811. It seems to be interwoven with the Wexford Girl, which is the Irish version of an English murder ballad that we'll talk about in a few minutes. Cecil Sharp encountered Rose Connolly in Appalachia in 1918, once in Virginia and again in North Carolina. Sharp had already published one collection of ballads at this point and found this particular trip to the mountains disappointing, finding, according to him, nothing that fit his interests, even though he found Rose Connolly, again, quote unquote found, right? And could have snatched it up like he did all the others. The song had been identified before, and it was clearly very popular and embedded in the local culture and was being sung all around the region. So it was culturally relevant in Appalachia. And yet, Sharp never published Rose Connolly in any of his collections, which contained nearly 400 songs. While Sharp didn't write much about his feelings about Irish culture, he was of a generation of white Englishmen who believed that the Irish was a distinct race, different and apart from the English. And in his work, he differentiated Celtic and English songs, considering English variations more sophisticated and more real, while Irish versions he believed were immature and less developed.
So weird. For instance, Sharp wrote, quote, the Celt will in all probability be attracted by those variations of ballads which are primarily sensuous and which satisfy his somewhat ornate feeling for beauty, whilst in the case of the Anglo-Saxon, those variations which make for self-expression will be given the preference, end quote. After one encounter with a ballad singer in North Carolina in 1916, Sharp noted his annoyance with the man who sat while he played, rested his fiddle on his knee, and improvised whenever so moved. Sharp later wrote that he was, quote, a bad singer and a very difficult fiddler to note from. His mother was a Franklin. He must have Irish blood in him, end quote. When he attended a fiddling contest in Knoxville, Tennessee, Sharp heard a man named Mr. Julian fiddle. He recorded that Julian's tunes were nice, but was ultimately not all that interested. Sharp wrote, quote, he said he was an Irishman, and he undoubtedly was. I questioned him about his name, which he said used to be Julian. No doubt it was originally Doolin, end quote. Not only were the Irishman's tunes not compelling, but Sharp doubted that Julian was the original spelling of his name. That sounded too English. Sharp also had difficulty when it came to Highland Scots, who he also felt weren't Anglo-Saxon but rather Gaelic. He summed up his feelings on all non-English speaking cultures when it came to ballads in 1917, writing, quote, "The Appalachian tunes, notwithstanding their gapped characteristics, have far more affinity with the normal English folk tune than with that of the Gallic-speaking Highlander, and may therefore very well have been derived from those who, dwelling on the borders of the Highland Kingdom, had become infected to some extent with the musical proclivities of their neighbors." For folklorists will, I think, agree, England and the English-speaking parts of Scotland must be regarded as one homogeneous area, end quote. So in other words, while there might be Celtic or Gallic influences on English ballads, those were merely in evidence of infection. The real ballads came from the areas of England and the Scottish-English border where English was natively spoken.
As a fun little aside, the rise of square dancing as a requirement in schools is directly connected to this period of interest in ballads and folklorists and ethnologists' racist theories that Appalachia was a bastion of Anglo-Saxon Americanness. Marissa, did you have to square dance in school?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I did too. So we can blame this on Henry Ford, who was the innovator of the American motor vehicle industry, who was also famously extremely anti-Semitic. In his view, modern music was dangerously influenced by Jewish performers and producers. Like Semple and like that quote that we gave earlier, Ford also thought Broadway jazz was too black and too Jewish. Content warning, because this is a gross quote from Ford's newspaper. The newspaper itself has a grotesque title, which is called The International Jew.
Yeah, also like almost all the quotes from his...
Well, yeah, it's called The International Jew. The whole thing is pretty bad. So here's the quote. "Many people have wondered where come the waves upon waves of musical slush that invade decent homes and set the young people of this generation imitating the drivel of morons. Popular music is a Jewish monopoly. Jazz is a Jewish creation. The mush, slush, the sly suggestion, the abandoned sensuousness of sliding notes are all of Jewish origin." And the rest of that article gets even more racist and more anti-Semitic, so I will just stop there. Ford believed that Jews were in a bid for total social control of the world. They were globalists, to use a term that is often used in modern discourse as an anti-Semitic dog whistle. Jazz and the modern dancing that went with it were tools that this global Jewish conspiracy used to control the masses and degenerate cultures. Ford believed that this was especially enticing to Black Americans, who he believed were more vulnerable to such attempts at social control. Old-fashioned folk dancing, especially square dancing, on the other hand, was, Ford believed, safely Anglo-Saxon, Christian, and American. Ford put tons of energy into pushing square dancing, funding country music radio shows, and even requiring that his employees attend dances. Through the 20th century, the push to establish folk and country music as the quote-unquote real music of American culture and square dancing as the highest and most culturally pure form of dance only strengthened. Individual states and localities added square dancing to their physical education curriculums, as we can attest, and there were repeated attempts to declare square dancing the official dance of the country or of individual states. And in 1982, West Virginia Senator Robert Byrd was successful in passing a temporary resolution that declared square dancing the official folk dance of the United States. The bill declared that, quote, "Square dancing is a joyful expression of the vibrant spirit of the people of the United States that demonstrates, quote, etiquette among men and women, and that it was a, quote, traditional form of family recreation which symbolizes a basic strength in this country, namely the unity of the family." I'm not entirely sure what the connection is between square dancing and the unity of the family, but you do you, Robert Byrd, excuse me. And there was something actually very similar at work in the UK at the same time, where the ballad hunter Cecil Sharp helped to revive traditional Morris dancing, which was likewise understood as culturally important and inherently British, and in some corners today is considered sort of nationalistic.
I'm glad that that Congress was focused on the important things in 1982.
Yes, we weren't fighting a Cold War or embroiled in scandals.
Right, or deconstructing our social safety net. We weren't. But at least square dancing was the national dance. But the reality was that by the 1920s and 1930s, as Appalachian music escaped from the mountains and became nationally popular as country and folk, while it was still very much informed by the British and Scottish ballads of yore, it was also shaped by a wide range of American instruments, new and old songs, and styles borrowed from Black performers. Most of Appalachia was also not as cut off and isolated as ballad catchers like to suggest. Especially with the introduction of the railroad, most Appalachians consumed national cultural products, national news, and took part in national trends. An example that John Williams gives of that is a song performed by an itinerant preacher and performer in the 1920s, decrying women who wore bobs and pants. If Appalachia was so cut off from the rest of American society, how did they know to criticize the urban culture and social trends of the 1920s? Traditional ballads remained a standard, but were supplemented by fiddle tunes, religious music and hymns, and what might be called, pop music? Sheet music that was nationally printed and cheap to buy.
Ballad catchers in Appalachia were particularly interested in American ballads that had derived from, of course, the Scottish and British ballads. One particularly meaningful one was the Gosport tragedy that we described before, in which the ship's carpenter lures his pregnant lover into the woods to murder her. And again, I hope you're noticing that this is a theme here, right? Most, if not all, murder ballads feature the murder of a beautiful young woman at the hands of a man. The Gosport tragedy has been traced to numerous other ballads with the same themes and often the same wording, but with slightly different names of places in Great Britain. So the Berkshire tragedy, the Oxford tragedy, and the Bloody Miller, among others. They're all sort of connected to the Gosport tragedy. But unlike some of the older British ballads, which told grim stories of murder and mayhem that were likely disconnected, at least by time, from any real original stories, these can be traced at least to some real-life historical inspiration. In 1683, a clergyman named Philip Henry wrote the following in his diary, quote, "I heard of a murder in Salop on Sab, day the 10th instant. A woman fathering a conception on a milliner was killed by him in a field. Her body lay there many dates by reason of the coroner's absence." Around the same time, the famed English diarist Samuel Pepys was collecting printed ballads and created a library including around 1,800 broadsides. One of them, the Bloody Miller, collected sometime between 1666 and 1688, included this in the preface, quote, "A true and just account of one Francis Cooper of Hoxtow near Shrewsbury, who was a miller's servant and kept company with one Anne Nichols for the space of 2 years, who then proved to be with child by him, and being urged by her father to marry her, he most wickedly and barbarously murdered her." Modern research conducted by the music historian Paul Slade shows that these two notations are referring to a very real crime that inspired the ballads. The murder of Anne Nichols by her lover Francis Cooper, likely in 1683. Records suggest that in the real case, Anne and Francis's child was born before Anne was murdered and was baptized Ichabod on March 24th, a few weeks after his mother's burial. Paul Slade makes the very interesting observation that the name Ichabod is biblical, coming from 1 Samuel, the child of the sexual sinner Phinehas. Ichabod is born after his mother learns of Phinehas's smiting in battle, and then she promptly dies herself. So the name seems to have been given on purpose to invoke this biblical story. There are no records that give us insight into Francis Cooper's fate, though he is listed in Ichabod's baptismal record as a homicide, indicating his guilt. He was likely executed, but no legal or burial records are extant to prove that definitively.
The Bloody Miller is about a miller rather than a ship's carpenter, but the storyline is very similar. The two court for a long period of time, but he is reluctant to marry her. When she becomes pregnant, she asks that they get married, but instead he lures her to a remote place, a meadow rather than the woods, where he kills her. It's likely that the Bloody Miller came first and then morphed over time into the Gosport tragedy and the Berkshire tragedy. Once it arrived in the U.S., these ballads morphed again at least once into two songs that became staples among Appalachian balladry and later in folk and country music, The Knoxville Girl and Pretty Polly. It's not clear which version arrived first, but Paul Slade connected it to the version of the Bloody Miller and the Berkshire tragedy called the Oxford Tragedy, which claims a specific origin for the murdered girl in the city of Oxford. In the U.S., where Oxford was less relevant, the location changed first to Lexington in an early 19th century version called the Lexington Miller, where the exact same story follows, just set in Lexington, Kentucky. He also connects the X sound in the location to different versions of the song: Berkshire, Oxford, Wexford, Lexington, and then finally to Knoxville. But not only did the location change, but the origin story as well. While the Bloody Miller could be traced all the way back to at least the late 17th century in the Pepys collection, Americans used that very old murder as a kind of scaffolding to hold a more recent American murder. In 1892, a young woman named Mary Lula Noel was staying with her sister and brother-in-law in Pineville, Missouri, when she was visited by a young man named William Simmons. When her sister and brother-in-law left to go back to their parents' home in nearby Joplin, Mary opted to stay with William for a few days, then travel with him from Pineville to Joplin to meet up with them. But instead of arriving, Mary was not seen again until her body was discovered in the Elk River, her body badly bruised. Footprints suggested that the couple had walked along the banks of the river before she was beaten and dumped in the water. Not long after, William Simmons was arrested and tried, and after a messy trial, he was sentenced to only 10 years in prison.
This story isn't exactly like the one found in those earlier ballads. For instance, we don't have clear evidence that Mary was pregnant, or that the two were in a pre-existing relationship, or that the issue of marriage was a point of contention between them. But the murder of a beautiful young woman in an isolated rural place fit into the frame provided by the pre-existing ballad. Some versions turned the Knoxville Girl into the Noel Girl, referencing Mary Lula Noel's last name and working the town of Pineville into the lyrics instead of Knoxville. For instance, a ballad recorded by ballad hunter Vance Randolph in Missouri is virtually the same as the Knoxville Girl. Here's the Noel Girl version. Quote, "'Twas in the city of Pineville, I owned a floury mill. 'Twas in the city of Pineville, I used to live and dwell." And here's the Knoxville Girl. Quote, "I met a little girl in Knoxville, a town we all know well, and every Sunday evening out in her home I'd dwell." So you can see the influence of the Bloody Miller, even though we don't know whether William Simmons was a miller, for instance, as well as the Americanized version of that, the Knoxville Girl, on this later Pineville Girl, right? Or the Noel Girl. Another feature of the Knoxville Girl that persists across centuries is a lie that the murderer tells to explain away the blood on his clothes. Quote, "I told my anxious mother I was bleeding at my nose." Various versions of the ballad include this detail, which folklorists connect to a common literary trope in British culture used to foreshadow something ominous, dating back to stories and diaries at least to the year 1180. In my mind, this is also very spooky, given one of the most famous recordings of the Knoxville Girl, which came out in 1956. The performers, the Louvin brothers, were famous for their eerie harmonies, which scholars of country music call blood harmony, which is the idea that some siblings have an almost supernatural ability to harmonize very closely and to switch parts intuitively based on their shared blood. Add to that the Louvin brothers' own bloody history. The Louvin's father was a violent drunk, and Ira Louvin grew up to be the same. In 1963, Ira tried to kill his wife by wrapping a telephone cord around her neck. To save her own life, Faye shot Ira 4 times with a .22. Somehow, Ira survived, only to bleed to death in a car accident just 2 years later when another drunk hit his car in 1965. So the song and its ominous nosebleed are connected, then, to the spooky beauty of the Louvin brothers' blood harmony, to Ira's abusive actions, and to his own violent and bloody death.
So as you can see in the history of the Knoxville Girl, the murder ballad that is well known today among folk and country music connoisseurs is actually the product of a long and circuitous history of real-life murders, folk tales, common tropes, and the evolving shared oral tradition of balladry, passed from performer to performer on both sides of the Atlantic. But as many ballads that are now closely associated with the genre of American murder ballads are, relatively speaking anyway, pretty new. An example is that Kingston Trio song, Tom Dooley. The song is really pretty basic in its detail. We only know that Tom Dooley is fated to hang, and that he's murdered a young woman with a knife, and that he was betrayed by someone named Grayson. The song was a massive hit, selling 6 million records, when the Kingston Trio, Dave Guard, Bob Shane, and Nick Reynolds, released it in the midst of the mid-20th century folk revival. This period featured artists like Pete Seeger, Woody Guthrie, Mississippi John Hurt, Hughie Ledbetter, nicknamed Leadbelly, and others reintroducing traditional American music, performing old ballads, folk songs, and labor music. This was also connected to the renewed interest in square dancing kicked off by Henry Ford, but these folks tended to be old school lefties who had very different ideas about the meanings behind traditional music. Tom Dooley was such a huge commercial hit that it led to a bit of a resurgence in the old murder ballad, inspiring others to record old murder ballads and write new ones.
As music historian Paul Slade notes, before the Kingston Trio recorded Tom Dooley, no one outside of North Carolina had really ever even heard of the song or of Tom Dooley. The ballad was almost hyper-local, telling the story of a very real crime that took place in mountainous western North Carolina. A man named Tom Dooley, which was spelled D-U-L-A but pronounced Dooley in the local dialect, was born in Elkville, North Carolina in 1844. Dooley had a long-standing relationship with a married neighbor named Anne Foster Melton. Anne Melton was beautiful and headstrong, and her husband didn't seem to mind her relationship with Dooley, I guess. Dooley enlisted in the Confederate Army in 1862 and in 1865 was taken prisoner and placed in a federal prison camp. It was here that his name first was recorded as Dooley, D-O-O-L-E-Y, when the government paperwork tried to render the phonetic pronunciation of his last name into, this bureaucratic material. When he finally returned home, poverty and wartime destruction had made life in western North Carolina very difficult, leaving most residents to scratch out a living as tenant farmers and sharecroppers. Tom started sleeping with the daughter of one such sharecropper named Laura Foster, but also maintained his long-standing sexual relationship with Anne Melton. Now also in the mix was a housekeeper in the next county over, Anne's cousin Pauline. This was likely amidst a network of sexual relationships people in the town were having with one another, married and unmarried. The result was not super surprising. The crew all shared syphilis with one another, likely first contracted from Pauline, who had taken the housekeeping job so she could maintain the medicine that she took to treat her infection. Tom must have contracted the disease from Pauline, then shared it with both Anne and Laura, and this led to some drama.
It seems that Tom ranted and raved around Elkville that he wanted to kill the person who gave him the infection. So too did Anne. They both seemed to place the blame on Laura, who was the least connected to the community and the newest in the town. Though Pauline was also newish in town, she had kinship ties to Anne and her family. At one point, Tom and Laura seem to have been discussing marriage, leading to speculation that she may have been pregnant. In late May 1866, Tom borrowed a mattock, which is a heavy tool for digging, from Anne's mother. That should be our new Patreon level.
Yeah, you're right.
So he borrowed this mattock, a heavy tool for digging, from Anne's mother and was seen swinging it just off a path near his family's cabin. Then Anne and Tom met at her mother's house and left together with a full canteen of moonshine. The next day, Tam met with Laura, asking her to meet him in the woods. Laura was seen taking her father's horse to ride 6 miles into the woods to the meeting place and never seen alive again. Tom, on the other hand, was seen whispering insistently to Anne later that night, then seen by his mother at home in bed. Meanwhile, Laura's father was worried about his missing mare, only to find that the horse suddenly turned up again with its lead rope gnawed through, as if it had chewed or pulled itself free from being tied up somewhere. Suspicion grew as days turned into weeks, and Laura did not return. At first, people speculated that Anne had killed Laura, but it soon turned to Tom, and in late June, the community was clamoring for Tom's arrest. At the place where Laura had told others she was planning to meet Tom that night, a search turned up horse manure and what looked like a pool of blood.
Tom and Anne seemed nervous, too. Tom showed up at the Meltons' house to retrieve a knife that he had left there, explaining that he was afraid that he was going to be accused of causing Laura's disappearance, so he had to get out of town. He had good timing because just as he made it out of the county, the town justice of the peace issued a warrant for his arrest. Tom was already on his way to Tennessee, though, where he went by the name Tom Hall and found work at the farm of a former Confederate officer named James Grayson. When he'd made some cash, he moved on again, walking west. 2 deputies from Elkville, trying to execute the warrant, traced Tom to Grayson's farm and asked the former officer for his help in tracking down the fugitive. With his assistance and local influence, the 3 men successfully located Tom in Mountain City, Tennessee, about 50 miles from Elkville. Meanwhile, Anne confided in Pauline that she was concerned that more evidence against Tom would be found, especially because she was worried that he had buried Laura hastily and that the grave would be uncovered. Anne's just out here blabbing all over the place. She needed Pauline's help to rebury the girl. After following Anne most of the way to the spot where Anne said that Laura was buried, Pauline freaked out, refused to go any further, and ran home. She then started drinking heavily and acting out, causing a scene eventually when questioned by the deputies, shouting, "Yes, I and Dooley killed her and I ran away. Come out, Tom Dooley, let us kill some more." She was not telling the truth. She was just like crashing out, right? The deputies didn't believe Pauline had actually killed Laura, but they did believe that she knew who had. So to get her to talk, they locked her up in the jail and told her that she was going to be tried for Laura's death. And pretty quickly, this did the trick. She cracked and told the deputies that she knew where the body was buried, leading them up onto the ridge where Anne had led her to rebury the body. There, a search party of local men found Laura Foster's body in a short and shallow grave close to where Tom Dooley had been spotted digging just off the path. Laura had been stabbed in the ribs.
In short order, before the trial even, the first ballad about Laura Foster's murder appeared in the form of a poem called The Murder of Laura Foster by a local writer named Thomas Land. The poem was a little more 19th century ornate style than a ballad, but the poem established that Laura was murdered by a groom or a lover she hoped to marry. It does not name the murderer or include any real specifics about the crime, and Laura is turned into a sweet, innocent girl. Quote, "Her youthful heart no sorrow knew, she fancied all mankind were true, and thus she gaily passed along, humming at times a favorite song." End quote. Local readers would likely know this wasn't a super accurate depiction of Laura, but it didn't really matter. It helped the story fit into the narratives that were familiar from sentimental literature and ballads. This poem even ends with the hopeful Christian image. Quote, "Then in a churchyard her they lay, no more to rise till judgment day. Then robed in white we trust she'll rise to meet her Savior in the skies." End quote. Anne and Tom's trial commenced on October 1st, 1866. Somehow, and no one is sure how, Tom managed to get the very famous former governor of North Carolina, Zebulon Vance, to serve as his attorney. Vance tried to make the argument that there was no way that the two could get a fair trial because emotions were so high and there was so much public opinion against the two. The court agreed and the trial was moved. Then Vance argued that the trial should happen separately, and again, the court agreed. When the trial finally started, the prosecution argued that Tom had contracted syphilis from Laura and subsequently given it to Anne, and in his anger, he took revenge on Laura. Vance worked hard to present Dooley as a brave former soldier who had been seduced into a relationship by a calculating Laura. But despite all his hard work, Tom Dooley was swiftly found guilty. Side note, it's wild that we have so much detail about this 19th century court case, which did not always have careful note-taking. In fact, there wasn't even a stenographer at the original trial, but Tom's attorneys worked to get him a retrial, which meant that they needed careful documentation of the original trial, which remains the most detailed documentation that we have of the case.
At this point, the story, complete with more identifying details, began to appear in local ballads. We only really know about them in retrospect because they weren't recorded or studied until the era of ballad hunting. In the 1940s, 3 versions of the ballad were recorded in North Carolina, which were described as, quote, very popular in the hills of Wilkes, Alexander, and Caldwell counties in 1867. Of course, those were the counties where Dooley and the whole crew lived and where the crime took place. The woman who collected the songs for recording also wrote that the song continued to be popular among mountain ballad singers and that the original song had been written by a black man named Charlie Davenport to the tune of a song that had been sung traditionally by enslaved people. That's, I think, in itself really interesting, considering that that was the kind of thing that like Cecil Sharp would have rejected, right? That African-American influence. The lyrics that were recorded in the 1940s are still extremely similar to the one recorded by the Kingston Trio. Quote, hang down your head, Tom Dooley, hang down your head and cry. You killed poor Laura Foster, and now you're bound to die. As those ballads were being composed and sung in 1867, the case was still not settled as the retrial dragged on. But many of the witnesses called to testify at that second trial failed to show up, including Colonel Grayson. Under growing pressure, the judge refused to issue continuances to wait for the recalcitrant witnesses and finally issued a hard deadline for a new trial. Without the witnesses, the case was retried, but it came to the same result. Tom Dooley must hang.
The hanging, held on May 1st, 1868, was a spectacle. Because the trials had dragged on so long and had been so heavily reported on, a massive crowd gathered at the gallows in a field to watch Tom Dooley die. Despite the ballad's evocative white oak tree, it was a constructed gallows, not a tree that was used for execution. In his final hours, Tom Dooley issued a confession, stating simply that he and no one else had killed Laura Foster. Just before 1 p.m., Tom Dooley was brought out in a cart and rolled through the street. According to popular mythology, Tom Dooley was singing his own ballad, which he composed for the occasion, while he was rolled along towards the gallows, but this seems extremely unlikely and doesn't appear in contemporary newspaper reports. Apparently, what Dooley actually did do was give an extremely long speech rallying against those who he claimed lied to convict him, and even pontificating on the Confederate cause. According to one account, an old man yelled from the crowd, quote, "Oh, Tom Dooley, hang down your head and cry, because you killed poor Laura Foster, and now you must die," end quote. Paul Slade writes that it seems unlikely that these were the actual words a person shouting from the crowd used, but it's interesting nonetheless, since it helps to confirm that the version of the ballad used that exact line was already circulating. Then, finally, Dooley was hanged. Anne's trial came not long after Tom's death, but was quickly dismissed. She wasn't being charged with the murder, but of accessory, because she, according to the prosecution, pushed Tom to kill Laura Foster. But while Anne was released and not executed, she didn't live much longer and died of illness in 1875.
The song remained mostly only locally known and sung. During the heyday of ballad catching, the song almost certainly was being sung around the mountainous Appalachian region of western North Carolina, but they largely ignored it because it was not the Anglo-Saxon ballad that they were after. It was recent, it was American, and it was salacious. Instead, it remained a favorite of folks in the area, passed down through families. Two performers, Doc Watson, who was one of my grandpa's favorites, and Frank Prophet, both learned the song from their grandmothers in the region as kids. Prophet, who made a living in rural Appalachia farming and repairing musical instruments, is largely responsible for the Ballad of Tom Dooley becoming probably the most well-known murder ballad today. Frank Prophet's granny, Adeline Perdue, was in the crowd, according to her, right, was in the crowd when Tom Dooley's cart rolled on towards his execution. She told her little grandson all about how Tom Dooley had been singing his own ballad while on his way to meet his fate. In 1937, a man named Frank Warner, visiting the area from New York, stopped to buy a dulcimer from Prophet, and as they were chatting, asked Prophet to sing him some of the old-time songs from the region. Warner became quickly enamored, and about a year later, he returned to Prophet's farm with an extremely rudimentary tape recorder. It was then that Prophet was recorded singing Tom Dooley. Warner later gave his collection of Appalachian ballads to the ethnomusicologist and ballad catcher Alan Lomax, who published it arranged for piano and voice in his 1946 book, Folk Song USA. A few years later, the three men of the Kingston Trio overheard someone singing at an audition in San Francisco and loved it. They looked it up in Lomax's book and put the song into their regular performance lineup. Imagine Frank Prophet's surprise when he heard his granny's song on the radio in the late 1950s. And eventually, in a case settled out of court, Prophet was able to arrange to share songwriting credit and subsequent royalties with Warner and Lomax's family for the song.
Tom Dooley was largely unknown until the Kingston Trio made it popular. Now, most iterations of the song are derived from their interpretation, but other more modern American murder ballads took on a life of their own immediately, spreading and inspiring dozens of variations across different genres of music. One such example is what is typically named Stagger Lee, but sometimes Staggo-Lee or Stacko-Lee. While it's a folk song about a real murder, everything else about it defies the pattern set by the traditional murder ballads identified by folks like Francis Child and Cecil Sharp. It's largely a song of the 20th century, with its earliest versions dating back to 1903. It's a song that originated outside of the heart of Appalachia and St. Louis, Missouri. And it's a very black song, telling the story of the murder of a black man at the hands of another black man in the midst of a very distinctive moment in African American culture. It's also very widely recorded, with around 400 versions performed and recorded by everyone from Elvis Presley to the Grateful Dead to The Clash and Amy Winehouse. The story goes like this. In the winter of 1895, a man named Billy Lyons walked into Bill Curtis's salon in St. Louis, Missouri. St. Louis was a unique place at the close of the 19th century. It was the center of riverboat culture, where folks working and traveling on the river came in and out of the city, frequenting bars, dancing to ragtime music, and buying and selling sex. Curtis's saloon was in a particularly rough part of St. Louis, a neighborhood called Deep Morgan, which was full of rowdy bars, loud music joints, brothels, and cheap places to get drunk. Nearby Curtis's was Bridgewater's, another notorious bar. The two joints had a deeply antagonistic relationship. Curtis's hosted white Democrats, while Henry Bridgewater was a well-known black Republican. Folks who frequented the bars treated them like rival headquarters. Bill Lyons, in fact, had gotten into trouble at Curtis's before when he brandished a knife at Bill Curtis until a police officer arrived and arrested him. But in 1895, here was Bill Lyons again walking into Bill Curtis's. As they walked in, Bill Lyons turned to his pal Henry Crump and asked to borrow a knife, explaining that every time he went into that place, it seemed he had to defend himself.
Just after Lyons walked in, Lee Shelton arrived. Shelton, who was nicknamed Stack Lee, sometimes worked as a bartender at Curtis's, sometimes worked as a carriage driver, and sometimes helped to run illegal gambling and sex work operations. Stack Lee was, at least according to most accounts, handsome and very well dressed, wearing only the latest fashions. He was what was nicknamed in St. Louis a Mac or Macaroon, essentially a pimp. He wore shining boots with mirrored toes called St. Louis flats, which acted like little disco balls at the ends of his boots, like sending little flickers of light everywhere.
Is this where we get like Mac Daddy from?
Yes, I actually think that is correct. Yeah. I thought that was fascinating. Yeah. He wore spats, striped gray pants, a black coat, distinctive patterned red vest, and a yellow shirt with a high-standing collar. Now, to top all of this off, he also wore a white bowler-style Stetson hat, which was the absolute height of style among the Macs of St. Louis. Shelton swaggered into Curtis's and exclaimed, "Who's treating?" Someone pointed to Billy Lyons, so Shelton made his way over to him, and the two joked around for a little while drinking. But after a few drinks, the conversation started to grow combative, and Lyons angrily whacked at Stack Lee Shelton's hat. The argument was likely more complicated than just two drunk dudes beefing. The two were enmeshed in these rival politics, right, of the Deep Morgan neighborhood. Lyons was a Republican and Stack Lee was working for white Democrats. But the slight, meaning, specifically Lyons hitting Stack's hat, was simply not acceptable. And Shelton demanded that Lyons pay him back for the damage that he had done to that beautiful Stetson hat. When Lyons refused, Shelton informed him that he would shoot him. When Lyons still didn't hand over the cash, Shelton started to hit Lyons with the butt of his gun. Then Lyons reached for that knife that he had borrowed from his friend Crump and said to Shelton, "You cockeyed son of a bitch, I'm going to make you kill me." Shelton was happy to oblige, so he aimed, and in front of more than 20 witnesses inside the saloon, he pulled the trigger.
Bill Lyons was taken out to a nearby hospital where he died a few hours later. Stack Lee Shelton, on the other hand, coolly walked out and went home, gave his landlady his gun, and went to bed. That was where he was arrested in the wee hours of the morning. Angry crowds, described by the press as the Henry Bridgewater faction, showed up to taunt Stack Lee as he was brought to the courthouse. Within days, Shelton had hired a well-known lawyer, Nat Dryden. This added another level of interest to the already flashy case. Dryden was well-known, extremely flamboyant, addicted to both alcohol and opium, and was locally known for recently securing a conviction for a white man who murdered a black man. Not something that was a given in the late 19th century. Dryden helped to get Shelton out on bail while he awaited trial in July 1896. The trial added another layer of drama to the case. Dryden made a self-defense argument that must have worked to some extent because the jury hung and was unable to come to a verdict. Shortly thereafter, Dryden dropped dead after an epic drinking binge. Without Dryden, Stack Lee wasn't quite so lucky in his second trial, and he was convicted and sentenced to 25 years in the Missouri State Penitentiary. But he continued to be a charmer in prison, and by helping the prison staff identify a theft ring, he gained a good reputation and was rewarded with parole after just a few years inside. Freedom didn't last long, though. He was convicted again just a couple of years later for robbery, and though he was paroled again, died of tuberculosis in 1912.
Within just a couple of years, the story of Stack Lee and Billy was already taking song form. In 1897, a newspaper in Kansas City reported that at an upcoming concert, a pianist would play, quote, Stack-a-Lee in variations, suggesting that it was already a popular song known for having different versions. Like other ballads, the song was likely actually a mishmash as performers took bits of existing songs and wove the story of Lee Shelton and Billy Lyons into them. In 1910, when Stack was still alive, the folklorist and songcatcher Alan Lomax, the one that we mentioned was pivotal in the history of Tom Dooley, first recorded a version of the song that was reportedly sung by the black men who loaded and unloaded riverboats in St. Louis. This version included the repeated line, "Po Stag-a-Lee," suggesting that Stack Lee, not the murdered Lyons, was actually the one that deserved the audience's sympathy. Subsequent versions added more to the story. Lyons is grieving but immoral wife, a barking dog, and of course that notorious Stetson hat. In 1918, the song had become such a standard that it inspired, in a gross sort of way, a pair of blackface minstrels, so white men performing in blackface, who styled themselves Stack and Lee. But it also inspired performers like Ma Rainey and Duke Ellington to begin to perform and record versions of the song as well. The song became deeply embedded in black musical culture, and legends of Stack Lee became staples. The writer and scholar Cecil Brown wrote in his book Stagg Lee Shot Billy about his uncle's recitations of the Stagg Lee lyrics, invoking him as a kind of model of Black masculinity. I'm going to quote him here. Stagg Lee is a metaphor that structures the life of Black males from childhood through maturity. The legend survives because Black men pass it on. As culture critic Greil Marcus observes, Stagg Lee is, quote, a story that Black America has never tired of hearing and never stopped living out like whites with their Westerns, end quote. So not unlike old English ballads that referenced specific crimes but spoke to larger themes and which were adapted and changed over time, Stagger Lee is a song about one real murder, but one which has come to convey much bigger and much older ideas about Black masculinity, power, and defiance. So as we mentioned earlier, in the mid-20th century, the folk music revival that was initially inspired by the interest in ballads and square dancing evolved into a huge musical trend. Artists who used traditional American musical forms to critique capitalism, like Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger, led the way, followed by people like Joan Baez and Bob Dylan, who helped to make that folk style popular on a far wider scale. And with that folk revival, unsurprisingly, came a new era for the murder ballad. Dylan's hugely popular 1963 song, The Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll, was an adaptation of Mary Hamilton, which is Child 173, and that was the song that we mentioned earlier, in which the Scottish lady-in-waiting to Mary Queen of Scots discusses murdering her baby. Dylan used the structure of the traditional murder ballad to draw attention to the racism at the heart of a very real modern murder, the murder of a Baltimore bartender named Hattie Carroll at the hands of William Zantziger, the white scion of a wealthy tobacco farming family in Maryland. Since the song Hattie Carroll, murder ballads have persisted, but have tended towards fiction rather than using real crimes as their inspiration. One of my favorite singer-songwriters, Jason Isbell, has used the format in recent years with songs like Yvette, in which the narrator describes preparing his Weatherby to shoot the father of a classmate who he is abusing, or in Live Oak, in which the criminal narrator maybe murders his lover so that she doesn't find out about his past. But each new murder ballad, even those that are purely fictional, are part of a long tradition that pulls together performers and listeners from the front porches of the mountains of Appalachia to the manor halls and rowdy taverns of the medieval Scottish England borderlands.
The end. How do you even, you know, I don't know. How do you even end that?
Yeah. How do you even end that is exactly right, because it could have been 6 times longer than this.
I guess the one thing I would say is, I think it's really interesting that really these ballads really genuinely are part of low culture, of lowbrow culture. Yes. But because the sort of Anglo tradition is so venerated, especially in America, that they have been elevated to this level of finery that really they aren't. That doesn't mean that they're not interesting and valuable. I think lowbrow culture is extremely interesting and valuable, you know? But it's really interesting to me that is the case. You know what I'm saying? And there are really similar folk traditions all around the world. I teach sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America, and there are all these folk traditions that are quite similar in almost every way, but because they are not Anglo, they are considered to be kind of lowbrow. And once again, that doesn't mean that people don't study them. They do, but they're considered to be kind of like popular culture, lowbrow sort of thing, not like this level of finery where we're getting with Anglo folk music. That's almost like how you would treat classical music.
Right. Yeah. And part of it is also like the passage of time, right? Like we always have a tendency to like venerate things that are older and have staying power rather than things that are newer, right? Like, even in like recent music, I'm thinking I'm like very conscious of this right now because Taylor Swift's newest album came out, and you see a lot of people being like, well, this is nothing like blankety blank previous album. This is nothing like 1989. When 1989 came out, they said the same thing about, well, this is nothing like the album before.
This is nothing like Red or whatever.
Exactly. So we have that, we kind of bias towards things that are older, that we tend to think that they have more kind of intrinsic value than newer things. I was really I did not expect this to go down this is something that I didn't know a lot about, and so I didn't expect it to be so much about not only like the deep history of ballads, but the racial and cultural aspect to all of this, right? I was totally fascinated by how much these ballads were held up as evidence of this kind of perfect, untainted, untouched, pure Anglo-American culture. And I think that there's definitely still elements of that today, especially when you think about like country music, for instance, as being kind of the inheritor of some of this tradition, even though it is very constructed, right? But that the claim that it often makes, that it is like the true American music that is somehow better or more real than other forms of music, I think is very connected to this. So
yeah, and I knew like some of this stuff. I didn't know anything about the music part of it, but I have read Albion Seed. Have you ever read that book? It's specifically about the transplantation, basically, of different kinds of Anglo culture, different kind of regions of Anglo culture to specific regions in the U.S. So it's like Appalachia got all the East Anglians and like that kind of thing.
Right. Yeah.
And so it's specifically tracing that sort of Anglo culture, and it kind of argues that the various areas, the various regions in the United States, not only Appalachia, that's one example, but that other regions in the United States, like specifically inherited a specifically regional aspect of Anglo culture.
Right.
Like I think the Tidewater area inherited more like the sort of London area or whatever, like they had, there's all these, I don't remember exactly. He talks about 4 different regions, but, and so a lot of his evidence is the written ballads. I have thought about this a little bit before, but not from this particular lens, and definitely not as in depth as you went.
Well, here you go. Here is lots of depth.
So it has all the good things.
Yes, indeed.
So thanks for joining us today. We invite you to follow us on Blue Sky and Instagram at dig_history. If you have a comment or a question, or you want to share some kind words with us, you can always email us at hello@digpodcast.org. We love listener mail. If you're an educator, we've got a compendium of episodes you can use in the classroom and free teaching resources, including full lesson plans. These are on our website, digpodcast.org. You'll also find full bibliographies, the scripts for all of our episodes, resources, and a link to our swag store and our bookshop at digpodcast.org. Thanks for listening. Bye.
Bye. Iambic refers to the stress placed on the syllable. Iambic refers to the stress placed on the syllables. Why can't I use the word syllables? Syllables. Especially with scandalous stories about criminals, murderers, and public education, is what I was just going to say.
Musically, hang on. Chivalric romances, sometimes written in poetic form, are stories that told the story. Can I say something other than stories that told the story? Turned up again with its lead rope gnawed through, as if it had chewed lead rope.
Oh, lead rope, not lead rope.
Sorry, that makes sense. I don't know, was just reading.